Okay, everyone. Welcome to the first of what will hopefully be a group of video presentations that outline each chapter that we go over in a summary form that you can kind of condense down into the ideas of what it is you need to know. I know that's a very important thing for you all and kind of how you encounter these assessments. So I'm going to try to break things down so you can build up and use and synthesize the knowledge that's been given to you and use it in what it is that we will do for our assessments. For those of you who are not familiar, in my class we use a Pearson textbook, Campbell Biology, Concepts and Connections. It's the 9th edition that was released last summer, so it's a very up-to-date. Pearson does a great job with their Mastering Biology. In fact, I just logged on to my Mastering Biology and they've kind of updated the format. And so they're constantly trying to improve things at Pearson, and my students last year really enjoyed the content that this text gave. Again, if you're following along in the presentation that you've been given, so the outlines of the slides that you've been given, you will notice that this is a much more condensed version. I've condensed it down to about 50 slides. You won't get as many of the pictures or many of the videos that we might have gone through in class. But Chapter 1 presents 3 big ideas. We're going to look at biology, which is the scientific study of life, and kind of get a definition that we can work with. Then we're going to look briefly at the process of science. I'll probably do the least amount of that in this video, even though we probably will have walked through that a little bit more in class. It's just kind of a review to kind of how it is that you think or should think in terms of thinking scientifically. And then finally, in this last little piece, this 5 unifying themes of biology, if I didn't hit this in class, what I hope to share with you all here and really hit home is this idea of the 5 unifying themes in biology is where we need to focus a lot of our attention. Because if you end up not being exempt for the Easter final, you will spend a lot of time discussing the 5 unifying themes in biology in the Easter final. So a good foundation here in August will be very helpful for that. So from the reductionist standpoint, let's look at biology. By the way, any of these terms that you see in bold are part of your key terms. So if you're looking at this kind of at the outset, those will be things that we could have a vocabulary quiz over, so be mindful of that. Biology is the scientific study of life. Now, that is as reduced as you could possibly get. So your immediate question should then be, well, what does that mean? What is life? And so life is best defined by its properties. So we more so deal with life with what we see and what we can see happening and what we can see acted out and played out on the stage, rather than kind of the description of kind of just life. So these properties include order, reproduction. Reproduction kind of goes back to really works within the contents of evolution, and when we talk about fitness, Darwinian fitness, we're talking about the ability to survive and reproduce. Now, it seems to me in that regard, we've always heard the term survival of the fittest. So at the outset of my class, I just want to talk about kind of doing away with that idea. Reproduction, on the other hand, is even kind of of greater significance. So keep that in mind. Growth and development is next. Energy processing, regulation, response to the environment, and evolutionary adaptation. So it's very important that you're able to list and define each of those in a manner that makes sense, or be able to explain them. So the next kind of important part of what life is has to be the cell. And there will be a few chapters on the cell that we'll get to, but this idea of the cell as being the structural and functional unit of life. Once we get to cell theory, that's one of the tenets of cell theory, and we need to keep that in mind kind of as the structural and functional, not just how an organism is built, but how it's built being related to its function. That's another unifying theme. So here's some pictures looking at the properties of life. We can see order in the upper left-hand corner, in that kind of this order being a symmetrical view of this plant. All organisms show order. All life is ordered into hierarchy, into hierarchical structures that follow patterns based on the environment that they're in, and that's consistent throughout each of these organisms. Reproduction, again, we hit that one a while ago. Growth and development. Now, we talk about individual organisms evolving, and that's something you've got to be aware of not doing. You can't talk about an individual organism evolving. Technically, individual organisms do not evolve, but they do grow and develop. They do experience both growth and development through patterns of life based on that organism's kind of how it has been optimized. Next, living things, properties of living things. They have response to the environment. You can see the Venus flytrap has sensory cells. It has receptor cells on that outsert of that trap that as soon as it senses movement, it's able to close in on the fly and respond to the environment that it's been given. Energy processing is one of the bigger parts of biology. You see the caterpillar up on the stalk of the branch there. So that picture is meant to show the interaction between heterotroph and autotroph, this flow of energy from the sun into the producer, into the consumer. All organisms experience one of those energy transformations. Next is regulation. You can see the lizard up on the rock kind of regulating its body temperatures. That speaks to the drive to maintain some level of homeostasis within the organism. There is a kind of, you could consider a optimal internal balance that each organism wants to follow. And then the final property of life is evolutionary adaptation. So biologists, that they take this life and they take those properties, right, and they grab the information from each of those properties, and from that and from a couple other sources, they're able to arrange the diversity of life, the difference of life, into groups, into taxonomic groups. And this idea of thinking was invented by Carlos Linnaeus in the 1700s. So kind of just this father of taxonomy, kind of giving to organisms. Sorry, I need to plug up. Pardon me on that, my bad. So taxonomists name species and classify them into broader groups. So this debate continues as far as how to classify each of the organisms. That's something we will deal with multiple times throughout this year. But the highest level of taxonomic relationship are called domains. And so domains, bacteria and archaea contain organisms with simple cells. Those simple cells are called prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are the single cell organisms with no nuclei. They still have genetic information. They have DNA. DNA is stored in plasmids or DNA loops within the cells. Those simple cells still have ribosomes, so they still have the ability to make proteins for that cell. They have cell membranes. They generally have flagella or ciliates, that hair-like structures that allow movement as a response to the environment, and those are helpful to those species. So those two domains are prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. Those are prokaryotic domains, bacteria and archaea. The third domain is the domain eukarya. Now, in the domain eukarya, these cells have nuclei. Okay, these cells have nuclei. These cells have membrane-bound organelles, and these cells have the ability to They have the ability to produce a little bit more. They have the ability to have a little bit higher function than the prokaryotic cells, but they still follow a lot of the same properties. But the biggest differentiation, keep this in mind, the biggest differentiation between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell is the presence of a nucleus. Within that nucleus in the eukaryotes, the DNA is going to be stored a little bit differently than it was in bacteria, and that's another pretty big distinction. Those picture kind of shows you the different domains. And then here are your prokaryotic organisms, bacteria and archaea. All of these individual green dots here in bacteria, these orange spherical shapes, those are all organisms. Those are all single organisms within. Those are not multiple organisms, even though those individual organisms are working together. The domain eukarya consists of protists. Now that's multiple kingdoms, so protists go in a lot of ways. There's plantae, fungi, and animalia. So all species, again, all species within all of these domains all carry these properties of life. Okay, so as you're thinking about those, as you're thinking about biology, you're thinking about the unity and the diversity of life. Biology, the study of biology shows more than any other kind of how organisms within a species are, and within each domain, in and out of domain, are incredibly diverse, but at the same time unified because they go back to those 7 properties that we mentioned earlier. So biologists study life across a very broad range of scales, all the way from molecules. Okay, these would be the molecular biologists. These are biologists that are going to be focused on DNA. They're going to be focused on proteins. When we get into the macromolecules section, these are the guys we want to. We talk about cell biologists that will focus more on the cells, not just the parts of the cells. And then finally, biologists also study the entire planet. The evolutionary biologists study the evolution within those sections of organisms. So biology is a very vast subject. In fact, biology should be taught in a couple different subjects, in my opinion. But anyway. What we need to focus on here are that emergent properties result from the specific arrangement and interaction among component parts. So because of all of these different things, molecules to cells to organs to organisms, there's this entire scope of the planet. You divide this scope into a series of structural levels, and from each of those levels there are interactions between the smallest to the largest part. Okay, so level number 1, when we look at the biosphere, the living sphere within Earth, that's level number 1. Level 2 is this ecosystem. So within this section of Florida, you'll have a specific ecosystem. Okay, that ecosystem has emergent properties that hit at the new level. Now at the community level, you've added different organisms. You've added specific trees, specific birds, specific fish, all acting together in the emergent properties of the community. Next, you have a population. Okay, within this biological, emergent properties emerge. New properties emerge at every level, still connected to the community, right? This school of fish has emergent properties that adapt that fish to that specific community, which adapts it to the ecosystem, which adapts it to the biosphere, kind of emergent properties at each one. We can break it down even further, as reductionism always does and helps, from the organism to the organs and organ systems. Okay, so you can kind of see the nervous system of this fish. There are its spinal cord with connections to its brain, its little fish brain, and how its fish brain are connected to its senses, and those senses, again, new emergent properties come at that. Next, you get tissues, and tissues are groups of cells that are working together. Okay, and specific nerve cells again. Okay, so that's the next. Even at the cellular level, emergent properties come. Then new emergent properties show up at the level of nerve cell, and then finally you have organelles all the way down to the molecules. So emergent properties, very important, very key to remember. Okay, in terms of the study of life. Briefly, what is science? Science is a way of knowing, an approach to understanding the natural world. We're going to try to look to use evidence-based process of inquiry to investigate the natural world. The scientific approach involves observations, hypotheses, predictions, tests, experiments, additional observations, and then an analysis of data. Scientific theory is a broad scope, is broad in scope, and it's supported by a large body of evidence. Now, in the biology textbooks, we don't like to get into the idea of law all that much, mainly because we don't have them. This isn't physics class. This isn't chemistry class. There aren't the laws of evolution. In physics class, you have the laws of gravity, the laws of motion, the laws of thermodynamics, and just constant law after law after law after law that all guides your process through chemistry. Now, we know that there are a lot of parts of biology that are beholden to the laws of physics, but then there's also a lot of biology that is untested in those realms as far as their own laws. So it's very important to keep that in mind. One thing that we look here when you're thinking about this is kind of what is science, this idea of what the scientific method is. One of the things I like about this book is they kind of get away from the idea of the scientific method, because the problem with the scientific method is it presents science as a linear straight line process. Now the issue with that for me is that leads to this idea of reduction, and you reduce something down to its smallest piece, and we did that in the emergent properties, but biology is different because at every level there are properties that emerge. That's really not the case in the other sciences. So when we observe the scientific method in biology class, it's a little bit more of a circular approach. I like to think of biology in terms of whole parts of the whole rather than individual processes. It's very important to remember. This piece, you were talking about the process of science and identifying kind of the optimized strategy of a beach population of mice and an inland population of mice. So this is kind of one of those things that's focused for you in kind of scientific thinking parts of your standardized test. That's why I kept it in. Learning to read kind of charts and analyze data. So the beach, the light habitat, there's the inland, the dark habitat of mice. So the number of attacks on camouflage models and on non-camouflage models in the light habitat, we had 2 attacks on camouflage mice, 5 attacks on non-camouflage mice in the light habitat. So there's a 71% chance that if you are a non-camouflage model, that you will be attacked. Same thing inland. 5 attacked on camouflage, 16 attacked on non-camouflage. And so a 76% attack on non-camouflage models. So first thing that's important to know, it's optimized to be camouflaged in both populations. The second thing that I'd probably say is more attacks happen inland than on the beach. So if mice were conscious, they probably want to move to the beach. Is kind of what I'd say there. Let me Marco Rubio really quick. Next, the process of science is repetitive, nonlinear, and collaborative. So this is kind of what we discussed a while ago. The problem with thinking about the scientific method in terms of biology is it's too linear. This kind of set, pattern, repeat, set, pattern, repeat. It doesn't fly as much in biology. Biology works on forming and testing hypotheses that's influenced by 3 things: exploration and discovery, the analysis and the feedback from the scientific community, and then the societal benefits and outcomes. Now, 3, 3 needs to make sure 3 stays in 3. We don't want societal benefits and outcomes, before we explore and discover and then analyze. We want to push that back. We don't But that's how that chart kind of flows. Okay, here's where I want to focus much of the work. So evolution is the core theme of biology. So life is distinguished by its unity and diversity. So that's kind of what the properties of life has shown us. Is this idea of getting this life word compressed into something we can grasp, an icon image of life. You could say it has unity and diversity. The scientific explanation for this university is evolution, which is the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from its earliest forms to the vast array of living organisms we have today. That's all really evolution is. It's an explanation for the process of change that has formed life from its earliest forms until today. And it is the core theme of biology. So biology is not in the light of evolution, without the light of evolution. And that's something we need to keep in mind. You don't understand biology if you don't understand evolution. And biology is a science that was not very well studied until we finally had a mechanism. That's why the discussion of evolution has been so important. A couple things to note about evolution. Charles Darwin did not discover evolution. A couple of other things. There is no such thing as this idea of group selection within evolution. And then the last thing within evolution, even though I'm going to struggle with this and I continue to struggle with this, when you think in evolutionary terms, especially non-human terms, you have to be careful in personifying the organism that we're discussing. If we're talking about the mice moving to the beach, mice don't think that. Now, they may migrate, survive a little bit better, and if they survive and adapt to the beach, that's fine. They'll stay there. But it doesn't necessarily, you can't put that conscious element on it. If you want more on that, you can take my sociobiology class. So look, these three birds, the American flamingo, the ruby-throated hummingbird, and the gentoo penguin, all of these birds, they're in some sense unified because they're all within the same family. Those taxonomic relationships, there's a lot of connectedness. But you can see there's also diversity from their neck size, from their wingspan, their ability to fly, their role within their ecological niche. Completely different, completely diverse. And each part of these species are optimized for specific adaptations to their environment. That is something we need to keep in mind. Okay, that's something we need to keep in mind. So, evolution is the core theme. Darwin synthesized, that's a very important term, he synthesized the theory of evolution by taking these observations, okay, that there are heritable variations amongst organisms, and there's also overproduction of offspring within organisms, and inferring that this idea of natural selection where unequal reproductive success leads to evolution of adaptations in populations. This is, again, we joke a lot about this. It's hard to sell a biology teacher on this idea of equality because if when an eagle comes down and snatches a salmon out of the river, it's very, very, or a grizzly bear snatches a salmon out of the river, it's very difficult to discuss equality. There's unequal reproductive success, and that leads to evolution in populations, evolution of adaptations within populations. But these two things that Darwin observed led to him inferring this idea of natural selection. Unequal reproductive success leads to evolution of adaptations in populations. We'll get to, obviously, a little bit more. So let's look at how this works out. So we have this population of insects with varied traits. You can see some are dark, you can see some are light, you can see some are grayish. Okay, now this bird, this predator, comes in and picks out one of these species. Okay, and this species is light. Now, one thing we want to pay attention to here in one is this population has a black, dark environment around it. So the darker insects are able to blend into this, and this light insect was very observable for that predator. So over time, what you see, because of that insect is no longer here to reproduce, there's an increasing frequency of traits that enhance the survival and reproductive success of the darker bug, okay, of the darker insect. So each species on Earth kind of has this family history. And that family history at this point, if it's alive now, it has a 3.5 billion year family history. And every single ancestor that led to you, to your dog, to your cat, to the rhinos that are out in the African belt right now, to any organism you can pick, they all have a lot of reproductive success. A species represents one twig on the tree of life that extends back through ancestral species and further and further and further. And that's a phylogenetic tree. We'll look at that a little bit later. The second core theme. Okay, the second core theme. So the first core theme, the second unifying theme that we'll get to, biology has 5 unifying themes. Evolution is the core theme. Second theme is that life depends on the flow of information. Okay, this is where we get into DNA. So evolution is the top dog in biology. The second is DNA. DNA was officially discovered in the 1950s. We were kind of going back and forth between what passed down genes. Was it a protein, or was it this idea of this nucleic acid? And then Watson and Crick kind of put the final death nail in that. We're dealing with nucleic acids, and we get more into proteins flowing information out, but for the most part we're dealing with DNA here. The processes of life all depend on the transmission and use of information. DNA is responsible for heredity and for programming activities in the cell by providing the blueprint for proteins. Okay, so your DNA has this blueprint on it to build all of the things that your body builds. And that's the same in all organisms. So information from the external and internal environment, including stimuli, signals, and pathways that regulate body processes and gene expression. So that's this idea of what happens outside. Sapolsky puts it this way, Robert Sapolsky, the human behavioral biologist from Stanford. What happens in your head affects the rest of your body. What happens in your body affects what's going on in your head. It's the same way with what comes on outside in the environment. What happens outside affects what goes on in here, and what happens in here affects what goes on out there. But there's this flow of information back and forth. Here is a model of DNA. DNA is described as a double helix. Okay, you can see the two helices, the two structures right here. That's a sugar phosphate backbone. Okay, 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group represented by that yellow rectangle. Okay, and then the 4 nitrogenous bases of DNA that are thymine, it's always connected with adenine, and cytosine, that's always connected with guanine. So it's within these letters, within the order of these nitrogenous bases on all of your DNA that determine the proteins that will be coded for to build the structures that you have within your body, all written out on that genetic language. Okay, that process, specific process, how do you take DNA language and make a protein? Okay, well, you do that by transcription and then translation. Okay, this process here, taking the DNA, taking a gene, and you make it take it from DNA and then transcribe it into RNA. Okay, to where once we get to this ribosome out in the middle of the cell, that ribosome is going to be able to translate that RNA into a functional protein. Okay, well, that's a little, again, very low resolution. Okay, there's a lot of processes that go into that ribosome, that protein being complete, but it makes the primary structure of the protein. So again, how does this play out in the cell also? Okay, this is again transformation of information. Life depends on this. Okay, so there is a signal of high blood glucose level, and that's going to cause the pancreas to release insulin. Okay, that insulin binds to the body. Okay, and the insulin binding stimulates the body cells to take up the glucose. So now the normal blood glucose removes the signal and insulin release stops. So all of those can take place within your cells. Core theme number 3, structure and function are related. So there's this relationship between the structure and function that can be observed at every level of life. So all of those levels of life that we talked about having emergent properties, structure and function, you can see the relationship of structure and function. At the molecular level, the structure of a protein correlates with its function. For example, hemoglobin molecules transport oxygen to the blood. Those hemoglobin molecules are specifically structured to carry oxygen. Okay, it is a design component to it, and those are optimized designs. Okay, evolution kind of shaped the hemoglobin to where it was specific for its role. On the cellular level, the long extensions of nerve cells enable them to transmit impulses from your spinal cord to your toes. Okay, the structure of these nerve cells. Okay, it's the structure of these nerve cells that take the information from the brain, from the brain stem, and allow voluntary control of your toes. If you feel something on your toes, it's going through the nerve impulses on your spinal cord, connecting it back up to the nerve endings in your brain to recognize what's going on. Okay? That doesn't occur if the structure is not specific, to the function. Okay? The structure and function are related. This is an incredible world if you ever want to look at something called biomechanics. Okay? So if you are studying giraffes, okay, let's say you're a biologist and you're studying giraffes, if somebody told you about this giraffe heart, okay, how big a giraffe heart was, a biomechanist could tell you how large the giraffe was just by looking at the heart. Because or how large if you saw the giraffe, a biomechanist could tell you how large the heart would have to be. It could be able to predict in a desert rat. It could be able to predict the amount of renal tubules that would be needed to support a desert rat that only has to drink once a month. Biomechanic could tell you exactly how long the renal tubules would have to be, because structure and function are related, and we know that, and we see that throughout. So whether it's the exoskeleton of this ladybug, okay, or it is the cellular structure of this plant leaf, both of those structures are optimized to fit the function of that organism. And that's within every property of life, from slowest to the reason. A lot of this. This is the red panda. It has this false thumb. Okay, specific structure and function are related. Why does it have the false thumb? It has the false thumb so it can eat bamboo. Plain and simple. Okay, it's adapted to the one thing that these guys eat. Okay, so that's what gives it there. 2 more. Okay, life depends on the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. A couple things. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. Matter is transformed. Okay, so this is this interaction between energy and matter that fuels living things. So energy flows to the ecosystem in one direction. It enters as sunlight. It's converted to chemical energy by producers. It's passed on to consumers, and then it is exited as heat. So we get energy from the sun. energy goes into the plants. Plants then are consumed by consumers, okay, and then the consumers take that energy, use it through cellular respiration, and exit as heat, okay. But life not just depends on the transfer of energy, but the transformation of matter. Okay, so matter goes in this cyclical pattern as well. So from atmosphere to the soil, okay, so through processes, rain, wind, erosion, atmosphere to the soil, cycling of matter. Okay, the rock cycle plays a huge role in this. Okay, through producers, consumers, and decomposers. Okay, so once that atmosphere kind of works through that soil, okay, producers are going to use the nutrients in the soil. Okay, the consumers are going to eat the nutrients that the producers provide. Okay, and then everybody's going to die, and decomposers are going to re-enter things back into the soil, and then that kind of gives it back to the environment. So that's the cyclical nature of the transformation of matter. So life depends on the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. This is a good chart, good graph here. Sunlight enters, inflow of light energy. Okay, the chemical energy is found in this food. Okay, found in this food in these plants made by the producers, and then the consumers, the animals, consume the food. Okay, and use that energy, and when they use that energy, the heat goes. So here is the flow of energy. Okay, the flow of energy, transfer of energy, sun to producers. Okay, into the food as chemical energy, outflow of energy because the animals, the consumers, consume the plants and then use that energy through heat. Okay. So the next part is that cycling of matter, kind of getting through this matter, that as all of this energy flows, okay, as all this energy flows, all of this matter is constantly transforming. Being used, being eaten, being decomposed, returning to the soil, and then from the soil being evaporated into the atmosphere and then back down pretty cyclically. Life depends on an interaction within and in between systems. This is called systems biology. This is an attempt to model the behavior of biological systems by analyzing interaction among their parts. So we're going to look at how these emergent properties that we studied, how do they act together. This is big in what's called environmental science. Okay, environmental science is going to deal with how these things interact, and biology has a lot to say about that. So emergent properties are the result of interaction between the components of a system. This is in your body. Okay, this is in your body in how your cells interact, how the respiratory system and the circulatory system are connected. That's interaction between within and between systems. Okay, those two systems work together to get oxygen to your blood, and it's that interaction system that life depends on. This also occurs in a ecological sense, and how multiple organisms work together to form a community, to form an ecosystem, and every organism within an ecosystem plays a vital role. What happens when you remove one of those organisms is the system doesn't play itself out the same way, and that causes a change and a shift in the environment. So hopefully, if you need to stop and go back, hopefully that was a little bit better of an overview, and hopefully you'll be able to use that. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll see you soon.